Chapter 3 of Armand Durand by Rosanna Leprohon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bruce Peary. Company still continued to come and go at Mr. de Courval's, for the month of October, with its brightly tinted woods and hazy amber sky, without speaking of the excellent shooting the environs of the place afforded, rendered the country quite as attractive as it had been during the summer months. Gentlemen with guns and dogs, gentlemen on horseback and on foot, frequently passed Durand's door, but Geneviève saw nothing of them. Mr. de Courval had frequently and kindly invited the new married couple to visit the manor house, but as Paul evidently did not care about doing so whilst there were strangers there, Geneviève remained contentedly at home. One afternoon she was standing in front of the door, looking at the distant hills glowing in the mellow golden light of that beautiful season we call Indian summer, when Mr. de Courval, accompanied by two gentlemen friends, passed on foot. They all three looked weary and dispirited, for they had been on foot since early morning, and when Geneviève, whom Mr. de Courval instantly accosted with his usual friendly politeness, asked them to step in a moment and rest, a thing she could not avoid doing without violating common courtesy, for Mr. de Courval complained of fatigue, her offer was gladly accepted. He introduced his friends, one a Mr. Caron, a gentleman of middle age, the other a handsome young cavalry officer named de Chevandier, who had come out from France to spend some months in Canada. The latter seemed equally surprised and struck by the pretty face and quiet, graceful manners of their hostess, as she placed before them tumblers with a jug of excellent cider, which we need not inform our readers was not home-made. Geneviève, however, was entirely unconscious of the particular attention with which Captain de Chevandier favoured her, and that very elegant young gentleman would have been highly mortified had he known that she had not even observed the glossy luxuriance of his dark hair and moustache, or the classic regularity of his features. Durand came in before the departure of the guests, and, quite unembarrassed, pressed hospitality upon them with kindly courtesy. De Chevandier's aristocratic prejudices were somewhat shocked by the appearance on the scene of this plebeian entertainer, but his ineffable airs were as much thrown away on the husband as his looks of admiration had been on the wife. At length the three gentlemen, rested and refreshed, took their departure, the military Adonis indulging in wondering regrets on their homeward way that such a charming little creature should be doomed to pass her whole life among cows, fowls, and all that sort of thing. After they had left, Durand informed his wife that he was thinking of paying a visit to Montreal, to purchase groceries and other necessary articles, as well as to see the merchant to whom he usually sold a large portion of his farm products, concluding by inquiring if she would like to accompany him. "I can spare you a few dollars, little wife, to lay out on ribbons in the fine shops, even though our butter and chickens have been failures," he added with a smile, expecting that Geneviève would eagerly grasp at the offer, for a trip to town, even without the promise of spare dollars, was considered a great privilege by the wives in Alonville. To his surprise, indeed disappointment, she reflected a moment, hesitated, then finally declined. The reason of this was the uncertainty she felt as to how she should act towards the Lubois. Did she go to town without calling to see them, and thanking Mrs. Lubois for the clumsy, old-fashioned gold brooch she had sent her as a wedding present, she might be taxed by the family with great ingratitude. And yet, on the other hand, did she present herself with her husband at their exclusive mansion, they might prove very unwelcome visitors. To avoid this dilemma, then, she resolved on remaining at home, especially as Paul would not be absent more than a few days. The day succeeding his departure, Geneviève, who was exceedingly fond of the open air, and could imagine no greater treat than to sit for hours on a bench in the garden or under the old elm that shaded so pleasantly her comfortable home, listening to the chirping of birds and insect life around her, betook herself with some pretence of needlework to her haunt behind the trunk of the great tree whose ample rotundity sheltered her in great part from the observation of passers-by, whilst its foliage protected her from the sun. She had been brought up in a dingy, dirty town in France, for there are dingy, dirty towns in that favoured portion of the globe, whatever may be said to the contrary, and the country was to her an unexplored world, as delightful as it was new. How she revelled in her own quiet way in its freshness, its beauty, its perfumes, and how every new phase of its life elicited an admiration which she did not dare to openly express, lest she should expose herself to ridicule. Perhaps this predilection was in part responsible for the lamentably slow progress she was making in the acquirement of housekeeping knowledge, for whilst she would be in person in the kitchen, her head aching, her cheeks aglow, midst the fumes of frizzling, stewing, or broiling, or what was still worse, washing or scouring, her thoughts would longingly turn to the cool, pure air outside, the rustling of the green boughs overhead, and she would inwardly think, with a sigh, how much she would prefer a piece of bread and a cup of milk enjoyed amid that pleasant repose to the most dainty banquet heralded in by such culinary struggles and efforts. Comparatively free from household troubles for a while, she had celebrated the first day of Paul's absence by making a dinner on the primitive articles of fare just mentioned, an arrangement which entirely suited her handmaidens, who, also fond of the dolce far niente, added a piece of cold meat to their dinner and were satisfied, ease making up for the frugality of their meal. Then, taking a pair of slippers she was embroidering as a present for her husband, and which she worked at in secret, wishing to surprise him, never doubting but that he would find them useful as they were ornamental, she installed herself in her nook at the foot of the old elm. What a glorious afternoon it was! How often she paused in her work to look from the far-off purple hills to the gorgeous coloring of the autumn woods, from the golden and azure glories of the sky above her to the flashing waves of the broad, silvery St. Lawrence flowing past. All was still. The birds had already winged their way to climes that offered them another summer, and the silence was only broken by the soft rustle of a leaf occasionally falling to the ground. Suddenly, however, a footstep near caused her to look up, and there, cap in hand, his most winning smile on his handsome, regular features, stood Captain de Chevandier. His manner was very courteous without being fulsome, and Geneviève listened undisturbed to some innocent remarks on the weather, the country, and the excellent shooting. The time passed so pleasantly that she was unconscious when he took his departure that he had been nearly an hour in conversation with her. The day following was as bright and pleasant as its predecessor had been, and after a very light meal she hurried off with her canvas and wools, not to the elm tree this time, for a sort of instinct told her it was too much in the line of road traversed by Mr. de Courval and his visitors, but to another equally favoured haunt under a crooked but shady apple tree in the garden. She was working most assiduously, for she wished to complete her little offering before her husband's return, when a clear, cultivated voice pleasantly inquired, "How was Mrs. Durand?" And glancing up, she saw Captain de Chevandier looking at her over the low garden gate. Geneviève felt anything but gratified by this incident, but she was too gentle to betray her sentiments on the subject, so she politely returned his greetings. Still, there was a considerable degree of reserve in her manner, and de Chevandier, at a loss how to proceed, looked about him for inspiration. By good fortune, his glance happened to fall on a bed of magnificent dahlias of various hues and shades, and feigning great admiration of their beauty, he asked permission to look at them nearer and gather one. The permission was coldly granted, and whilst dwelling with the air and manner of a connoisseur on the rich tints and peculiar beauty of the specimens before him, he contrived to introduce a graceful compliment to the exquisite taste of the fair mistress of the garden, and to the success which had attended her efforts. "You give me more credit than I deserve, Captain de Chevandier. 'Tis the old housekeeper who lived with my husband before his marriage who deserves all your praise." De Chevandier bit his lip, and inwardly blessed his stars that none of his witty, caustic companions of the mess table were present to witness this signal discomfiture. Soon recovering himself, he resumed: "Well, that will not prevent me choosing with madame's permission a couple of those splendid crimson ones," and he suited the action to the word. Then, from the flowers, it was natural to talk of the country, and by a very natural transition, from the country to France. Ah, here was a link between them at last, and de Chevandier was not slow to seize upon it. Though a native of Paris, there were few parts of his sunny land which he had not visited, and even with the dingy little town, Genevieve's birthplace, he was acquainted, having been detained there once a whole day by bad weather, during which time he had continually cursed it as the smallest, meanest, most insufferable spot on the surface of the globe. His recollections of it were now, however, of a different nature, and he spoke of its simple church, the quiet little cemetery, with a pathos that almost brought tears to Genevieve's eyes. "Ah, Mrs. Durand," he impetuously exclaimed after a moment's silence, "how miserable you must feel transplanted from our lovely land to this ungenial clime! What are we here, children of France, but poor exiles?" Genevieve was by no means prepared, despite her love of fatherland, to go such lengths as this, and raising her eyes with a look of astonishment which never wavered before the half admiring, half sentimental gaze bent on her, she rejoined: "Miserable, do you say? Why, Mr. de Chevandier, I have known more real happiness and quiet during the last few months than I have ever enjoyed in my life. France is dear to me as a reminiscence, but here, in Canada, my affections as well as all my earthly hopes are centered." This was another discouraging conversational blow, from which, either unable to rally or inferring from Genevieve's manner that his stay had been sufficiently long, he rose, and after a few parting words, uttered in the same strain of respectful courtesy with which he would have addressed a lady of the highest rank, he withdrew. As he closed the gate after him, however, he muttered: "What a straight-laced, unsatisfactory little creature! But then, what matchless eyes! What taper fingers! Surely that thick-headed husband of hers cannot expect them to do much in the way of milking or butter-making. Ah, my worthy Durand, I am afraid you will find out too late that you have blundered egregiously in your choice." With a look of deep thought on his usually careless features, he strolled leisurely back to Mr. de Courval's. The ensuing day, de Chevandier made his toilet with elaborate care, and having armed himself with some newspapers and magazines which he had lately received from France, he bent his steps about the same hour in the direction of Durand's habitation. Genevieve was not under the elm, nor, on looking over the gate, could he see her under the apple tree. Evidently she did not wish for any farther interview, but de Chevandier was not easily daunted, and rapping with the light cane he carried against the door, he inquired of the untidy, uncombed girl who opened it, if madame were in. "She is somewhere in the garden," was the curt response, and feeling she had done all that could be expected from her under the circumstances, she clapped the door to with a suddenness that caused the visitor to recoil. "What savages!" he exclaimed. "But I will not give it up. I must seek her in the garden." Had Captain de Chevandier been asked what end or aim he had in view in paying such marked attention to Mrs. Durand, he would unhesitatingly have answered that he intended no harm. Mrs. Durand was a very pretty as well as refined woman, and a harmless sentimental friendship kept up with her would serve greatly to lighten his visit at the Manor House, which otherwise was passing very heavily. But despite such vague semi-innocence of purpose on his part, alas for Geneviève if she encouraged or listened to his overtures, for no religious principle guided him. The only restraining influence he acknowledged was the world's code of honor, and what a lax one that too often is. Inwardly wondering, almost chafing at the intense interest she excited in him, he unlatched the little gate, and picking his steps amid pumpkins, cucumbers, and melons, all growing in the most neglected luxuriance, he made his way to the little rustic summer-house, constructed out of a few boards, round and over which a wild grapevine had been trained, forming a covering of pleasant verdure. Geneviève was still at the eternal worsted work, as de Chevandier inwardly stigmatized it. He would much rather have seen her melancholy and listless, but with his usual graceful ease he entered, offering his credentials in the shape of the books and papers he had brought with him. Geneviève could not do otherwise than thank him for his attention, and besides, she was really pleased to see the names and pictures of places and things so familiar to her. Whilst she was looking at the illustrated frontispiece of one of them, he took up the work she had laid down, smilingly asking for what the monument of female industry and patience he held in his hand was intended. "A pair of slippers for my husband," was the reply. An expression of keen irony flashed across de Chevandier's features, and as he thought of honest Paul in his rough country boots striding through the muck of the farmyard, and then looked at the delicate combination of beads and silk floss intended for him, and the fairy-like fingers which had worked it, his lip curled, and he involuntarily said, "Mr. Durand is a very happy man, and will, of course, thoroughly appreciate this fairy gift. I hear he is an excellent farmer, understands all about subsoiling, drainage, cattle, and such necessary horrors." Geneviève looked at the speaker. Novice as she was, she divined the covert contempt lurking beneath the half-patronizing, half-ironical compliments thus paid to Paul, and, keeping her eyes still steadfastly fixed on her companion, she rejoined, "My husband is not only a good farmer, but an honorable, upright man, one whom the most indifferent of wives could not help respecting and loving." There was something grand in its way in this fearless, frank expression of her sentiments from one usually so reserved and reticent as Geneviève Durand, and whilst de Chevandier's heart inwardly did her homage for it, it also awoke with him a sentiment of jealous irritation of the man thus favored and honored. It taught him also that in the young wife's presence he must avoid uttering even one word that could possibly be construed as disrespectful towards Paul, and he hastened to repair his blunder by making some friendly, complimentary remark regarding Durand, uttered with the tact and delicacy of which he was eminently master. Geneviève resumed her work, and whilst her fingers moved with nimble skill, de Chevandier talked or read aloud short passages from the papers he had brought with him. The afternoon shadows were lengthening when the young wife suddenly rose to her feet, saying he must excuse her, as she might be wanted at home. He escorted her to the door, and as he lingered at the steps, saying a few farewell words, two figures, standing at an angle of the barn, closely watched their movements. These were Manon, the girl who had given so characteristic a reception to Captain de Chevandier, and Olivier Dupuis, one of the most inveterate gossips of the village. "And you tell me," he said slowly, ominously shaking his head, "you tell me that fine town gentleman comes here every day and spends hours with madame," a scornful inflection on the word. "The husband, too, away. Well, well, Paul Durand, you could not do like others and take a smart, sensible girl of the village for your wife. You wanted a dainty bit of china ware instead. Oh, we shall see, we shall see. When do you expect Paul home? Tomorrow, I think. Good day then, Manon, and should you ever marry, don't tread in your mistress's footsteps. Keep your advice, Père Dupuis, till it's asked. When I'm married, I shall do just as I like." And with this amicable farewell, the pair separated. The rain poured down in torrents all the ensuing day, and de Chevandier had to forego his intention of calling on his charming neighbor, lest a visit under such circumstances would render him ridiculous. He therefore betook himself in a very ill humor to the sitting-room, where he divided his time between tossing over Mr. de Courval's books, which were nearly all on agricultural subjects, and kicking aside or swearing at the half-dozen dogs that enlivened the home of his bachelor friend. Geneviève, on her part, was as happy as possible. The house, under the united efforts of herself and handmaidens, shone with cleanliness, whilst Manon, by some extraordinary coincidence, had made some excellent pies, and turned out, for once, a baking of bread, neither burned outside nor raw inside. By way of climax, the wonderful slippers, happily completed for the occasion, were ostentatiously spread out on the back of Paul's armchair, which was drawn to his favorite nook near the flower-filled window. Then Geneviève hastened to her room, and after a wistful look at the fast-falling rain, to whose violence her husband was probably then exposed, entered, with pretty wifely vanity, on the duty of endeavoring to make herself look as charming as possible. Her task was not a difficult one, for at all times pretty, excitement rendered her doubly so, and the flutter of pleasure arising from the expected return of her husband after this, their first separation, brought a light to her eyes and a flush on her cheek that made old Dupuis's appellation of china ware passably appropriate. End of chapter 3.